have another week of our Past to Present lecture series. And I just want to give a gentle reminder before we start that if you didn't check in with the front desk already when you first came in, please make sure to do that as you're leaving, just so we can keep an accurate head count of everyone who visited us today. So this morning, we are welcoming Zachary Stocks to the Maritime Museum. Zachary Stocks is a public historian, interpreter, and the executive director of Oregon Black Pioneers. He served as program director of Historical Seaport and visitor services manager of Northwest African American Museum. Zachary is a former intern of Colonial Williamsburg and the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, as well as a seasonal park ranger right here at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park. He's a busy man. Zachary holds a BA in history from the College of William and Mary with a certificate in public history from the National Institute for American History and Democracy and an MA in museology from the University of Washington. Zachary lives right here in Astoria. We are super lucky to have him here in town. If you could all please hold for questions until the very end, we will have plenty of time for you to pick his brains after he gives his presentation. So, without further ado, please welcome Zachary Stocks.
Hi everyone. So like Julia said, I live here in town. It's always really exciting when I get to give presentations here in Astoria. I give a lot of talks on behalf of Oregon Black Pioneers. Usually that means driving 3 hours to give a very general talk on Oregon's Black history. But this is a unique talk. It's one I've given only once before, and the other time I gave it was also here in Astoria at Fort George for a Thursday night talk. So this combines both my interest in professional work in Black history as well as my interest in professional work in maritime history. So this is a really fun one, and I'm really grateful that you all came out for it. Come on, clicker. Clicker problems?
Here it comes, Zachary.
Oh, wait. I got it. No, it was the on button. Okay, so I'll give you a quick synopsis, and I promise the slides are not usually this text heavy. So before she became Oregon's most famous shipwreck, the steamship Brother Jonathan was a symbol of freedom for Black communities across the West Coast. Brother Jonathan and other steamers played an important role in the West Coast Underground Railroad, ferrying hundreds of free Blacks and at least one enslaved person from San Francisco and Portland to the Black expat community of Victoria, BC. And so this afternoon, we're going to talk about the Black history connections to this famous ship, the pre-Civil War immigration of Black freedom seekers to Victoria, BC, and the fate of specific Black individuals associated with the Brother John. And very quickly, I'll just mention about Oregon Black Pioneers. So we are Oregon's only statewide African American Historical Society. We are a small team. It's just me and a half-time communications manager. But our work is really important. We share the experiences of people of African descent wherever we have information about them, in some cases going back more than 400 years. And we interpret those experiences across the entire place that we call Oregon. So whether it's here on the coast or down in the Alvord Desert, if there's Black history there, we have stories about it. So if you want to learn more about that, please visit our website, OregonBlackPioneers.org. And if you're so inclined, we really appreciate donations, especially this time of year, sort of the calm before the storm that is Black History Month. So, starting at the beginning. It's a great place to start. So there are frequent references to Victoria that we started to find in some of our records that we keep at Oregon Black Pioneers. The way that we work is that we have a lot of materials that have been compiled over the past 30 years by different researchers who've been looking up information about very specific individuals, right? And so when I first got hired for the job, I started to familiarize myself with a lot of those materials. And in the process, I kept seeing Victoria coming up again and again. And I thought that was kind of strange. Today, Victoria has 85,000 odd people and about 1,100 Black residents. That represents about 1.3%, even smaller than Oregon's Black population, believe it or not. But still, census data for Oregon shows a strong connection with Canada at this time period, in the 1860s in particular. In the year 1860, there were no Black Oregon residents who listed their birthplace as Canada. And in 1870, there was just one, a 10-year-old named Rufus Waterford. But in the 1880 census, there were 32 Black Oregonians who listed as being born in Canada, which represented 7.5% of the entire Black population of Oregon. And of those, only 13 were born before 1858. So what that tells us is that between 1870 and 1880, there were a lot of Black families coming to Oregon, along with young children who had been born in Canada. So I started to wonder, why? Also, in our records, we had a lot of references to a ship called the Brother Jonathan. I had never heard of this ship before, and I thought it was interesting that I found it mentioned multiple times in files that we have related to different individual people. So the one that you see on the left here is a newspaper clipping which reports on, the quote is, "A large number of colored men and women who had drowned in the incident of the Brother Jonathan shipwreck in 1865. So I read that article and learned that the steamship was bound for Victoria, BC, when it wrecked off the Oregon-California border. And the second photo you see here on the right is from an Oregon Historical Society catalog card about a man named Alan Flowers, who was a well-known member of Portland's early Black community. And in it, it mentions that Flowers had once been a cabin boy on this ship, the Brother Jonathan, and that he had married his wife, Louisa Flowers, in Victoria, BC. So I was thinking, what is going on here? There's got to be a connection to this sudden increase in the number of Canadian-born Black Oregonians, and also this ship, which apparently was bound to Victoria when it crashed and carried Black people on it, some of whom survived and some of whom did not. So I decided to start looking into this story to figure out more. And to do that, I had to at least figure out, what is this ship? So that is the Brother Jonathan as it appeared in 1862. The SS Brother Jonathan was a steam-powered barkentine built in Brooklyn, New York in 1851. That name comes from an Uncle Sam-like character, which represented the spirit of New England in literature and media. So as John Bull represents England, Brother Jonathan represents us. At the time, the fastest way to travel from the eastern United States to California in the Oregon Territory was still by boat. And this was the era of steamships. They didn't have to go around Cape Horn anymore. Now, passengers would board steamships on East Coast cities, and they would go to Panama's Gulf Coast. And then there they would be escorted across the Isthmus of Panama, along with their goods, to the Pacific side, where they would then board a second steamship and transport up to the U.S. West Coast. Brother Jonathan was one of these East Coast transport vessels. It was incredibly fast, and on its very first run, it set a new record time for the round-trip voyage from New York to Panama and back. 31 days. Lightning fast. So as you can see in that map there, that shows you the route that they would take. Does this have a laser pointer?
Yes.
I should check it out first. Well, I'll just point it out to you here. There's a little star where you can see the Isthmus of Panama there, that little red star I put on the map. So that is where the ships would be going to. Typically, they would come down to Panama here on the blue line, but the Brother Jonathan had a different route. So in 1852, a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, maybe you've heard of him, he purchased Brother Jonathan and he shipped it around Cape Horn to now become part of the Pacific fleet of this steamship transport route. Vanderbilt negotiated an exclusive contract to transport people and goods across Nicaragua and onto the Pacific states. But that contract was canceled in 1856 and the business failed. So that star represents what made Brother Jonathan's route different from every other steamship that was transporting East Coast passengers to the West Coast. So from that point on, after 1862, it became a West Coast passenger transport vehicle. It was an important means of transportation for American and foreign fortune seekers to reach Canada's Fraser River during Canada's gold rush in 1858. It was also renamed the Commodore in honor of Cornelius Vanderbilt after he sold the ship. So the Commodore now was actually the ship that carried the news that Congress had ratified Oregon's statehood. So the statehood bill was originally signed by President James Buchanan on February 14th, 1859. That's Oregon's birthday. And from there, the news was sent by telegram to St. Louis, then carried by wagon to San Francisco, and then sent as mail to Oregon aboard the Commodore, this ship. And on March 15th, 1859, the vessel docked in Portland and delivered the news to Oregonians that Oregon had been a U.S. state for the past month. So while February 14th is Oregon's birthday, the truth is, nobody knew that it was Oregon's birthday until March 15th. In 1861, the Commodore, that's the ship, not Cornelius Vanderbilt, was sold once again to the California Steam Navigation Company, and they renamed the vessel back to Brother Jonathan. Its regular route was from San Francisco to Victoria, BC, with stops in Crescent City and Portland along the way. Now, on July 30th, 1865, Brother Jonathan left Crescent City on its way to Portland on what would be its final voyage. About a half hour after its departure, the weather became incredibly dangerous. And after making it as far north as present-day Gold Beach, Oregon, the captain determined that it was not safe to continue. Curry County had less than 500 residents at the time, and it did not have a safe harbor on the Chetco River for the ship to dock. And so the crew had no choice but to turn back toward Crescent City. As the ship sailed south, it struck an uncharted rocky outcrop south of the Oregon-California border. The damage was severe and fast, and the Brother Jonathan began to sink immediately. Although there were enough lifeboats on board for everyone, only 3 of the ship's lifeboats could be launched in time. And of these, only 1 made it to shore, landing 8 miles below what is today the town of Brookings. The 19 people on that lifeboat, which reached shore, were the only survivors of the wreck. Everyone else, 225 people, perished, which made it the deadliest maritime disaster in American history at that point. Now, outside of treasure hunters, this is where most people's knowledge and interest in Brother Jonathan ends. It was carrying a bunch of gold, and that is a whole direction that I'm not going to get into in this talk. So most people think that's where the story ends. But what about all that Black history connection that I talked about at the beginning, right? And what's the deal with Victoria? So it was from here that I actually began my research. And I'll point out that you see the ship's wheel there? Just put a pin in that. Keep an eye on that image. So part 2, steamships for freedom to Black communities in the West Coast. All right. Now, although there is a strong link between Oregon's Black community and the Brother Jonathan, this link actually begins in California. It was there that a fugitive slave case set in motion a huge movement for Black freedom abroad, and that was the case of a man named Archie Lee. Archie Lee was an enslaved man brought to Sacramento in 1857 by his owner, Charles Stovall, who was moving to California from Mississippi. After a short amount of time, Stovall decided he would return to Mississippi, but Lee had no intention of going back. He ran away and he hid in a Black-owned hotel. Stovall eventually found Lee, but sympathetic Californians refused to let Stovall take Lee away. They claimed that Stovall had no right to keep Lee enslaved in California, which was a free state. In January 1858, Stovall sued for Lee's return. The case made it all the way to the California Supreme Court, which made a baffling decision. They ruled that any person arriving in California with the intention to live there could not legally own slaves there. But because Stovall was in poor health, the court ruled that Lee must return to Mississippi with him and act as his caretaker. That's like the Seinfeld, he's my butler. Well, Lee was transported to San Francisco for a ship back to Mississippi with Stovall. But before he could be boarded, a group of abolitionists intercepted him by small boat and cut him loose, and he fled. That boat was apprehended, and everyone aboard it was jailed, and a new series of trials was organized. After that, Lee was finally declared a free man in April 1858. Now, this Archie Lee case was significant, as it came right on the heels of the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision, wherein Chief Justice of the United States, Roger Taney, ruled that as an inferior race, Black people could never be entitled to citizenship or any of the privileges that came with it. Free Blacks in California faced a future where they would have no civil rights, and where slave catchers on patrol for fugitive slaves could take Black people at will and be rewarded for it, even if they snatched up people indiscriminately. The last straw came in in 1858 when Representative J.B. Warfield of Nevada County introduced a bill to prohibit people of African descent from coming to California and require that all Black Californians register themselves and carry identification papers at all times. Those who could not produce those papers on demand were liable to expulsion or forced labor. Now that bill failed to make it out of committee, but many local Black leaders saw this as a sign that they were not safe. Not in California, not even in the United States. And so they decided to make plans to leave the country. Two prominent Black Californian abolitionists named Mifflin Gibbs from Philadelphia and Peter Lester from New York, they began organizing within the community in Exodus. Some urged a trip to Mexico or to Panama, but the U.S.'s recent victory over Mexico in 1848 in the U.S.-Mexico War led some to fear that the U.S. would seek to colonize those nations for new territories for slaveholding. In 1862, in fact, President Lincoln invited 5 Black leaders to the White House to try to convince them to lead an exodus of Black Americans to Panama, which they rejected. So in April 1858, the same month that Archie Lee's case was finally resolved, a community meeting was held at the AME Zion Church in San Francisco to discuss the plans to immigrate from the United States. In attendance was Peter Neglee, the captain of the Commodore, the brother Jonathan. He was sympathetic to Black Californians' dilemma, and he offered to transport anyone who desired to leave the U.S. on his next outbound voyage to Victoria. He was a personal friend of James Douglas, the future first governor of British Columbia and the highest legal authority in Western Canada. And Neglee said he would personally lobby for the Black Californians to be welcomed there as asylum seekers. Now, interestingly enough, you might already know this, James Douglas, who was previously the chief factor at the Hudson Bay Company, Fort Vancouver, after John McLaughlin, James Douglas had African ancestry. His mother was a free Black woman from Barbados, and his father was a Scottish merchant. On April 22, 1858, about 50 Black Californians took up Captain Neglee on his offer. It was the beginning of a multi-year mass migration to Victoria and BC's Gulf Islands. The exact numbers are not known, but most sources estimate the number of Black American migrants at more than 500 persons. A Canadian National Historical Marker in Victoria, places that number at closer to 800. The transportation was almost exclusively steamship, though some travelers did finance their trip by driving cattle from California as far north as the Puget Sound before boarding a steamship for the rest of their journey. Captain Neglee's Commodore, the brother Jonathan, was likely the most frequently used, as it was the first, and thus best known vessel to make this exodus, and by all accounts was still one of the fastest ships on the West Coast. The entire trip from San Francisco to Victoria took about 10 days. Now that quote you see on screen here, that is a description of one of the passengers, one of the Black passengers, making that journey to Canada. And you'll see we get a little shout out here on the Columbia River. They talk about how Portland, OT, we went ashore and walked and saw some of the principal streets. It is a dull-looking city. But then, here, on the 4th day, we arrived at the mouth of the Columbia River. The scenery along its banks of the river is varied and beautiful. How about that? So over the next several months, Black refugees in Victoria settled into their new life and encouraged others to join them. Those who followed included some of the most financially independent and educated Black Americans on the West Coast. This was a migration of the elite, as much as one could be elite and Black in the United States at that time. Now, one of the reasons Victoria was considered in the first place is because of the recent gold rush on the Fraser River. In 1858, gold was discovered north of what is today Vancouver, and the tiny provincial capital of Victoria became a massive boomtown. 30,000 people, many of them Americans actually, flooded into Western Canada. Governor Douglas, not wanting Americans to profit at the expense of Canadians, set restrictions on gold claims, which benefited British citizens alone. The new Black residents recognized this and saw an opportunity to solidify their security in Canada while also making a bold statement against the United States. Mifflin Gibbs wrote to Governor Douglas, and together they created a pathway for immediate British citizenship for Black Americans who moved to BC. This allowed Black Americans who swore an oath of allegiance and became naturalized Canadians to live there permanently, keep their gold earnings, start businesses, and take advantage of all the privileges of citizenship which were denied to them in the United States. The men were also able to vote immediately, which they did as a bloc, allowing them to elect Mifflin Gibbs to the city council, making him only the second black man ever elected to public office in Canada. And in what I feel is a huge middle finger to the United States, the members of the black expat community organized the very first militia in British Columbia, which was called the Victoria Pioneer Rifle Company. Their mission was to protect against potential incursions from American slaveholders looking for potential conquest, and to regulate the actions of American citizens in BC when they come for the gold rush. And that image you see there is an image of Victoria Pioneer Rifle Company, made up exclusively of black Americans who had fled the United States to Canada. Now, the mass migration of blacks from the west coast to Victoria is part of a larger and less talked about dimension of the Underground Railroad, which is its maritime connections. In the book Sailing to Freedom, the authors make the case that the majority of enslaved black men and women in states like Maryland and Virginia reached free states by boat, whether they paddled it or sailed across state lines or were stowaways on vessels. There's only one known example from the west coast of an enslaved person escaping to freedom in Canada, and his story is one of the maritime examples. Charles Mitchell was 7 years old when his enslaver, James Tilton, brought him to Olympia, Washington Territory. Tilton was a politically connected Democrat from Indiana, and President Pierce appointed him as the Surveyor General of Washington Territory in 1855. In 1860, the 12-year-old Mitchell was doing a job for Tilton at the port, and there, a mariner from the black community in Victoria named William Jerome noticed Mitchell and spoke to him. When Jerome learned that Mitchell was enslaved, he stowed Mitchell aboard the steamship Eliza Anderson, and with the support of a black cook named James Allen and a black passenger named William Davis, they successfully smuggled him out of Washington. Together, they got him as far as Victoria. The ship's captain had found out during the journey and was furious, but after spending the night in jail, the Victoria legislature refused to extradite Mitchell back to the United States. Now, I wish I could say that all this happened with Brother Jonathan. When I first started to do this research, I was getting excited to think that that's what I was going to find. But the ship was actually called the Eliza Anderson. But I still wanted to mention that the black Victorians recognized that steamships were the fastest way to freedom, as they had seen firsthand. And then after establishing themselves in Canada, they used their positions to free the last enslaved person in Washington state history and one of the last enslaved persons on the West Coast to their new community. So that's the first part of the story. Now, what is the Oregon connection? So while this story is largely centered on California, there are many Oregonians who also took part with this exodus to Victoria. And the reason that's rarely mentioned is that California had way more black residents than Oregon did at the time. There were 962 black Americans in California in 1850. There were 55 in Oregon. So we're talking about close to 10 times. So while there were already 2 black Oregonian families that I could name before even beginning this research who were part of this migration. First was Abner Hunt Francis and his wife, Sidna Dandridge Francis. In the landmark book on Oregon history, A Peculiar Paradise, the author, Elizabeth McLagan, stated that this couple immigrated to Victoria aboard the steamship Brother Jonathan. During this research, I realized that it actually was not on the Brother Jonathan. It was a ship called the Sierra Nevada. But nonetheless, Francis and Abner Francis and his wife were 2 very prominent members of Portland's black community. And they also had come from Buffalo, New York, where they were closely associated with New York abolitionist Peter Lester, who you've already seen on screen, as well as Frederick Douglass, Buffalo's own native son. And Francis and Douglass continued to exchange letters when Abner Francis moved with his brother to Portland in 1851. Let's see. Francis opened a clothing store on Portland's waterfront in what is today the intersection of Nadeau Parkway and Southwest Harveyville. This made Francis the very first black business owner in Portland history. But in 1849, the Oregon Black Exclusion Law had made it illegal for black people to live in Oregon. And the Francis brothers and their families were targeted for expulsion from the state. Over 200 white local residents successfully petitioned to prevent the brothers from being excluded from Oregon, which demonstrates the significant role that they have within the community. And many of those families are prominent names within Portland today, like the Cooch family, for example. I think was the very first signatory to prevent their expulsion. But nonetheless, the damage was done, and Abner and Sidna realized that they were in a vulnerable position in Oregon. And once this immigration to Victoria had begun with the black leaders in California, notably Peter Lester, his pen pal, they too decided that they would make this journey to Canada. So Isaac, Abner's brother, died in 1857, and Oregon's 1859 Constitution was passed, which barred any new arrival of black people into the state. So they were pretty convinced that it was time to leave. Sidna's parents actually moved first. So they were from Philadelphia, but it seems at some point they moved to California and then to Victoria. So they went in 1857 to visit them in Victoria, and then in 1859 decided to leave and join them. They built a home in town, which is the home that you see on screen there. And when, where are we? Yes, in Victoria, the Francis moved into the Dandridge home, which Abner inherited after John Dandridge's death. The family would remain in Victoria the rest of their lives, and did not return to the U.S. after the Civil War, as many of the black asylum seekers had done. I'll point out that that little image on the corner there is a map detail that shows the Francis store in Portland. The other black person I could mention by name with a connection to this was the one from that first source at the top, Allen Flowers. You might recall that this mystery was kicked off in part because of that catalog card from Oregon Historical Society, which said that he was a cabin boy with Brother Jonathan. Well, Allen Flowers was born in 1847 in Columbus, Ohio. He, as a child, went west to Sacramento for the gold rush, and then found work in the San Francisco maritime trade. Flowers was 17 or 18 in 1865 when he deserted his position as cabin boy on Brother Jonathan and decided to remain in Portland. It was a decision that saved his life, because just 3 months later, the Brother Jonathan sunk. Louisa Flowers was born Louisa Thacker in Boston in 1849. Not much is really known about the Thacker family, but Louisa was living in Victoria in 1885. Perhaps the family had come west to San Francisco after the gold rush and then joined the migration to Canada in 1858. But we don't have any evidence to confirm it. In 1885, Louisa and Allen were married in Victoria. They moved to Portland a year after, and Allen began working for Union Pacific Railroad. As part of his work, the teenage Allen Flowers would have been familiar with the black community of Victoria. Whether he met Louisa there when they were both young is unknown. But the fact that he traveled to Victoria to marry her suggests that there was still communication between the black residents of Victoria and the black community in Portland as late as the 1880s. Perhaps Flowers' role as cabin boy with Brother Jonathan made him a known figure in BC. It's possible that this vessel was the first thing that he and his future wife had in common. In Portland, the couple was active in the city's social and philanthropic circles. They were leaders in their Bethel AME Church and a number of prominent progressive organizations. They purchased a home on East First Avenue and then purchased the adjacent plots and constructed a through road to First Avenue to Union, making them technically the first black land developers in Oregon. They became successful enough to eventually own 4 homes simultaneously, which each of their children would live in. It's this series of homes that you see here in that little small cropped image there. None of them remain, unfortunately. So, to find the other black Oregonians who took part in the maritime migration to Victoria, I had to dig into the sources a bit more. Thankfully, I had already had a pretty robust collection of census data with a registry of black Oregonians in the 1860, 70, and 80 censuses. So I started looking for sources about the black Victoria community and found a PhD dissertation from 1950. And in the appendix was a, quote, partial list of black immigrants to BC from 1858 to 1871. It had 200 names, though most women were simply listed as and wife, besides the name of their husband, so we don't know their names, unfortunately. So I had to retype the names of each Victoria immigrant into Excel, and then I highlighted those cells in green and pasted them into an Excel sheet containing the names of every known black resident in Oregon named in the 1870 and 1880 census. And then I sorted that whole list alphabetically and looked for duplicate names where the 2 green highlighted names showed up side by side. The ones that appeared were the names of people who were both mentioned in the Oregon census and the known list of black Victoria expats. So I came up with 9 exact matches, as well as 11 partial or plausible matches. So let's say that the exact matches alone, just 9, represents an accurate ratio of Black Oregonians in Victoria to the Black community there overall. So the community peaked in its first year that the Black expats arrived, 1858. And thanks to the Fraser River Gold Rush and the census collected there, we know that that was about 1,000 persons. So Victoria in 1858 had 1,000 Black immigrants who had come from the United States. And there were 200 named in that PhD dissertation. I found 9 names that were the exact match in my research. And so I did the thing that you learn in math class where you cross them this way and you do that way to solve to find x. And in doing so, I found that it's a realistic estimate to say that 9 out of 200, that's 4.5%. The Black population in Oregon at the time was 55. So 4.5% of that, where am I? I lost my math, I'm sorry. Where are we? 45. 45 out of 1,000. So that seems like a pretty insignificant number, but when you consider how few people were in Oregon, Black people were in Oregon at the time, 45 is pretty substantial. And even a handful of takers would have meant a huge demographic shift in the number of Black people in Oregon overall. And the names on screen here, I'm going to talk about who some of these people are. So one of those people who had migrated from Oregon to Victoria was a man named John Dees. This was pretty surprising. I had never heard of him before. He doesn't appear in any Black home or business registries in Portland, and the only time I found hits with his name were in an 1875 Oregonian article reporting news from Victoria which mentioned a Dees Creek. He doesn't appear to have done much in Oregon. But in Canada, John Dees was a prominent figure of that Victorian expat community. I have to give a lot of credit to the BC Black Historical Awareness Society for sharing a lot of information about this with me. So Dees was a tinsmith from Charleston, South Carolina. He came to Victoria in 1862, and he continued to work as a tinsmith. And there, he saw that miners were paying good money for salmon, and since he was a tinsmith, he knew how to make cans. So in 1866, he opened a salmon cannery on an island in the Fraser River, and continued to work there. He found a business partner, and together, they created the first salmon cannery on the Fraser River. When his business partner died, it became Dees' business by his own. The cannery was at one time the leading producer of salmon of canned salmon on the Fraser River. And it bears this label, which has his name on it. And that label, interestingly enough, was designed by a man named Grafton Tyler Brown, the first Black artist in the West. And in 1878, competition became too steep. Dees sold out and he moved to Portland, where he would die in 1880. So the island where he operated is now called Dees Island. The creek is Dees Creek. And the site of this cannery is a Metro Vancouver regional park. I can count on probably my hands, just my fingers here, the number of geographic place names in Oregon named after a Black person in Oregon. And there's a monument, there's actually a geographic place name for a Black Oregonian in Canada. I just thought that was amazing. Another name that came up was George Riley. I know I had heard that name before. I was thinking, who is George Riley? Well, it turns out I had seen this poster before from Oregon Historical Society. So George Riley, before 1858, we don't know much about him, but when he returned to the United States from Victoria, he became a noted orator. He is said to have returned to Oregon in 1869 after a 2-year absence on the West Coast, meaning he likely came straight from Victoria to Portland and then left for a time and then came back. He was mentioned in the Oregon census of 1870. Now, perhaps it was on the East Coast he became a famous orator, we're not sure. But by the time he came back to Oregon, he was a prominent speaker giving lectures about Black male suffrage, a new right that Black people had to vote, and how they could use that vote to build collective power. He gave a talk on January 1st, 1870, just 1 month before the ratification of the 15th Amendment nationwide. That talk was at the Philharmonic Hall, as you see here, which today is the Arlene Schnitzer Concert Hall. So if you've ever seen a show downtown, that huge theater, George Riley spoke there. Where are we? So he probably was a pretty good speaker on this subject. In Victoria, the Black immigrants took advantage of their voting rights and voted as a bloc. As I mentioned before, they were able to elect Mifflin Gibbs to the city council. In 1869, Riley had moved back to Portland, and he was part of a group that purchased 67 acres of land in the brand new city of Tacoma, Washington. And that tract became the city's historically black hilltop neighborhood. Of the members of that real estate investment group, he was the only one to actually move to Tacoma. And in doing so, George Riley became the first black resident of Tacoma. So those are just a couple of highlights I wanted to mention. But now we have to go back to the ship and talk about all those who did not survive that shipwreck. So as you see here are some newspaper clippings which mention incidents of black people who perished in that shipwreck. So this went down in July 1865 again, and when it crashed, most of the bodies were never recovered. A mass grave of 66 persons was made in Crescent City, though only 28 are named on the memorial there. The 225 casualties included an unknown number of black men and women. The ship had a crew of approximately 50. We know that black men were ubiquitous on steamships of the era, where they worked as cooks and as waiters and as coal shovelers, stewards on dining cars and sleeping berths, many different positions where you would find black people working on steamships. The dead whose bodies were recovered included 2 men of the crew later confirmed to be black, a coal shoveler named John Clinton and a cook named Charles Law. Others are likely, however, crew members' race was only mentioned for the bodies that were recovered. From the passengers, the number of black dead is also unknown. The Oregon Statesman correspondent in Jacksonville reported, quote, "Quite a number of colored men and women washed ashore on the beaches of Oregon's south coast in the days following the wreck," end quote. Several days later, the coroner at California's Del Norte County listed 9 black or mulatto victims from the 34 which had washed ashore north of Crescent City. The San Francisco Evening Bulletin confirmed 4 black victims who may or may not have been among the known black or mulatto victims reported in the Examiner. Those were a Mrs. Wendell and her child, Mr. and Mrs. George Church, and all of them were residents of Victoria, BC. By my count then, the Brother Jonathan's approximate 245 passengers included at least 18 black passengers or crew. That seems like a lot to me, given how much smaller the West Coast black population was to the white population. My main source on the Brother Jonathan tells me that by 1865, steamship travel had become inexpensive, and there were many ships now making this route, and the age of these vessels was climbing. This would have been a rough and uncomfortable travel experience. The main deck on the Brother Jonathan would have been a cheap ticket, so perhaps the marginalized group like black Californians could have easily been passengers on Brother Jonathan at a higher rate than white passengers. So with that in mind, the black victims may have been even higher than 18. We're not sure. Now I want to go back to that fellow named George Church, because I found this in my research. So Church was one of the only black victims mentioned by name. He was apparently identified by a banknote in his pocket from the Bank of Victoria for $200, about $2,200 today. This tells us that he was a Victoria resident, and it's confirmed because his name appears in that 200 black immigrant list from the PhD dissertation. But why was this black Californian back in San Francisco and then returning to Victoria? It might suggest that other black expats had made visits to the U.S. often during these years. Did the black Victorians, well off from their gold rush success, continue to contribute material support to the Union during the Civil War? I wish I had answers. I'm inclined to say yes. Now, not much is known about George Church himself, but when I searched his name in the historic black newspaper registry, I found these 2 interesting classified ads. The first was published in a New York newspaper and appears to have been placed by Church himself. In it, he's putting out a call for information on the whereabouts of several children of Frank and Safrana Van Buren to try and connect them with a relative of theirs. I don't really know what's going on there. I couldn't find any hits on Ancestry.com for those names. But my guess is that this was a family separated by slavery, and Church had become acquainted with a member of the family and took it upon himself to try and reunite them. Notice also by the time that this ad was actually run, Church had already died in the Brother Jonathan wreck. Who knows if anyone tried to respond to this ad? The other ad is from after the Brother Jonathan sank, and it's an ad to try and locate Church's San Francisco relatives, presumably to bequeath them his possessions after death. And if you notice the executors of Church's estate, they're Mifflin Gibbs and Abner Hunt Francis. the two people I've already mentioned in this talk. So while I don't know much about who George Church was, it's clear that he was in a position of relative wealth and status and occupied the same social circles as the most prominent members of Victoria's black expat community. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is the so-called 4 black seamen. So I read a book called Shipwrecks of Curry County, Oregon, which had a chapter on the Brother Jonathan. And in it were photos of the Brother Jonathan Memorial at Crescent City, and it included a list of the crew and this interesting tribute, quote, to the 4 black seamen who, through their heroics, saved 19 people from the Brother Jonathan, quote. Now, in truth, they saved 15 because there were only 19 survivors, so that number includes those 4 individuals themselves. But I immediately started to search for more information about the story, and I called the Del Norte County History Museum in Crescent City and asked them if they could tell me more about these 4 black seamen. And unfortunately, the director of the museum told me that they were not black, but they were Portuguese, and that this was all nonsense. And in my line of work, I actually hear things like this all the time. A lot of people don't want to believe that stories that have black people associated with them, that they're actually black. So I was pretty skeptical of that claim. But that was a pretty particular thing for her to say. Portuguese, what does that mean? So I went back to my book on the Brother Jonathan, and I found where she got that information from. It turns out that the author of that book, he used the following reference. The book is called Treasure Ship SS Brother Jonathan, by the way. In the footnotes, it says this: 4 colored seamen reported among the survivors by the San Francisco Evening Bulletin. However, the San Francisco Daily Bee on August 11, 1865, clarified that they were not Negroes, but were Portuguese, and had been rescued from a sunken whaler. So that tells us that, no, they weren't black, they were Portuguese. But they gave us the specific newspaper passage when that was reported on. So I decided to take a look at that myself. So looking at that article, the one referenced in the book, what it actually says, August 11, 1865, is, quote, the seamen saved and mentioned in the dispatch as Negroes were Portuguese, among the crew of a whaler recently burned by the Shenandoah, and this was their first trip on Brother Jonathan. So that statement to me does not dispute the fact that they were black, it just adds additional context that they were Portuguese. And why would they be black and Portuguese? Well, it just so happens that there's a Portuguese series of island chains off the coast of West Africa. Perhaps you've heard of the Azores or Cape Verde. These are places predominantly populated by black African people who speak Portuguese as their first language because of colonialism. And it's been this way for hundreds of years. So I started to think that these were actually black men from Portugal's African maritime colonies who had come to the United States to work as mariners. And I consulted the Nantucket Historical Society to see if there's precedent for this. And it turns out there's a lot of precedents for this. According to them, New England whaling ships regularly stopped in these West African island chains on their long journeys to the Pacific, and the inhabitants of those islands were almost always Africans ever since they were first colonized by the Portuguese in the 1500s. So to test my hypothesis, I decided to look into the other half of that reference from this newspaper article, which says that these were men who were part of a whale ship destroyed by the DSS Shenandoah, and see if I could find out information about who the crew were from that ship. Those ships. I'm not going to get too far into this, but perhaps you've heard of the Shenandoah. It was a Confederate warship that raided Union whale ships in the Pacific to try and destroy some of the economic base of the United States and disrupt the U.S. Union efforts against the Confederate States. It actually single-handedly destroyed the whale fleets in the Pacific. It was pretty devastating to that industry. By 1865, the Civil War was over, but the Shenandoah didn't even know, so they continued raiding ships in the Bering Straits of Alaska. And that is the time when all those ships were destroyed and their crews were bonded in San Francisco. A total of 21 whale ships were destroyed by the Shenandoah that summer. So what I decided to do was find the names of all the crew members from all 21 of those whale ships that were destroyed by the Shenandoah that summer, and cross-reference them with all the characteristics that were kept according to the Nantucket Historical Society database of seamen. We can find out if they were from Portugal, or if they were from the Azores, or if they were from Cape Verde. and if any of their physical descriptions match those of black people. These having details as specific as woolly hair or dark skin. Sometimes they call them African. So this was a very time-consuming process. I found hundreds and hundreds of names that I had to cross-reference, and unfortunately not every one of those 21 ships had a database of their crews listed. But I think 20 of them did, so I had a huge sample size to work with. So I won't talk too much about what each of those ships are here, it would be too time-consuming, but I cross-referenced all of these and tried to isolate the names that I thought were the best candidates for possibly being those 4 colored seamen. And what I found is, it's highly plausible. There were many people whose complexions were noted as dark, whose language was Portuguese, and who were on these ships at the time. Now, none of them were listed as being born in Portugal. No one was born in Portugal who was on any of these whale ships destroyed by the Shenandoah that summer. But many of them were clearly black. So we're talking about people who don't look like Cristiano Ronaldo, right? But they are Portuguese, but they are Portuguese in terms of their nationality and their language, even if they themselves are African. So that led me to believe that someone from this list was probably, or 4 people from this list probably are 4 colored seamen, but I couldn't say for certain who any of those people were. And that is where my research ended when I gave this talk last spring at Fort George. But we streamed that talk. It turns out that I was contacted by someone who was a genealogist, and they sent me a photo of this gentleman on the left named Ned Hunter. And the description that came from the Humboldt State University with this photo says, Ned Hunter, standing in front of Kate's Auto Garage in the town of Klamath. This old man is the father of 1970 resident of Martins Ferry, Jim Hunter. Ned Hunter was raised as an Indian, although his father was a Negro, supposedly having been Negro John, the father of Taloa Amelia Brown, and himself a survivor of the 1865 wreck of the brother Jonathan, on whose crew he served. So that was a startling revelation. And to have this photo of a person here, it's hard to see here, but clearly a black person depicted in this image, who by description was raised himself among the Klamath Indian tribe. And we have that corroborated in the census records, which show him listed on the Indian census rolls, but his father is listed as birthplace United States. So a black American. Now it's interesting that it says his father's name was Negro John, right? Well, John, I looked back at the list that I found and found many Johns. There were, I include that description here. There were at least 3 men who were on one of those ships destroyed by the Shenandoah that summer, whose name was actually John Brown. And there was, one of them had dark skin, but no other nationality or race descriptions included. So my thinking is that at least one of those 4 colored seamen was this person who later fathered this man named Ned Hunter with a native woman, and then disappears from the record. And it mentioned also in that same description that he was also the father of a woman named Taloa Amelia Brown. Well, the Taloa is a tribe. It's a tribe in California. And so I started looking for who's Amelia Brown, and I found her descendants on Facebook, actually. And she told me all about her grandmother, who incredibly lived to be 111 years old. I was skeptical of it, but it's corroborated in her birth and death certificates and on her headstone. So she lived an incredibly long time. She was born in, what year? No, that's not right. It looks like I didn't write it down, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, she sent me this photo of her grandmother, who, if you take my word for it, also appears to be a black woman, or at least mixed black and indigenous woman, who lived among the Taloa people her entire life. She actually has some baskets that she weaved that are in the collection of the University of Oregon's Museum of Natural and Cultural History. So we have a black woman here who became a culture keeper of an indigenous tribe of Northern California after the relationship between her father, a survivor of the shipwreck, presumably the same Negro John, who was the father of this man here as well. So there's more research that needs to be done. But at this point, I could say with great confidence that the director of the Del Norte County Museum is wrong. These were not men from Portugal. I did a lot of research to do my very best to give her the benefit of the doubt. But as far as I can tell, this is an example of 4 people of African descent who spoke Portuguese, who were the survivors of the shipwreck, and it helped to actually paddle that one boat to shore and allow for the other 15 survivors of the Brother Jonathan to make it to shore. So this is a site of great heroism, again, of Black history and heroism associated with this one ship. Really remarkable. And so my closing thoughts. To wrap it up, the Brother Jonathan, when it sank on July 30th, 1865, it was not just a terrible loss of life, but it was also a loss of one of the most important vessels in the West Coast Black history. The ship was literally a vehicle to freedom for hundreds of Black immigrants, a source of opportunity and hope for employees, a chance for a new life after a terrible tragedy, and a scene of great heroism as new tragedies occurred. The collective memory of Black communities in San Francisco, Portland, and Victoria all have included experiences had aboard the Brother Jonathan. The image on the right is that same wheel that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, the wheel of the Brother Jonathan. It's in a restaurant, like a TGI Fridays type restaurant. Yeah. It's important. It's a seafood restaurant in Portland. And the image on the left there, just to leave you with this, the image on the left there is a newspaper clipping I found in my research for this, and it's a remarkable story. I should have wrote the year now, I'm sorry I didn't. But from the early 1800s, I think around the 1840s, a description from a Black newspaper of a Black writer who wrote in to suggest that perhaps Black people could find their greatest freedom in the Oregon country, as they could leave behind the pain and racism that they were feeling in the eastern United States at the time. Which to me just demonstrates that Black Americans have always been looking for a place where we can feel safe, a place where we're welcome, we can build the kind of communities that we want to live in. And for a time, that community was Victoria, BC. Yeah. So, that's all I have. Thank you very much. So we have 10 minutes. I ended right where I wanted to. So if you have questions, I'd love to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Zachary. That was amazing. I really appreciate you coming in to share that story with us. I'm going to come around with the microphone. If you could please speak into the microphone as you ask your question. That way everyone can hear. Any questions for Zachary?
First of all, great talk.
Thank you.
Did you get your doctorate? Did you get your doctorate?
Not yet.
Working on it?
Sometime soon. Soon. Sometime in the next 20 years.
He's a little busy, Ralph.
A little busy.
I think it was well done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been in the maritime industry for my entire life, and I'd like to know a little bit more about our brothers and sisters out there.
Mhm.
So, if you have any kind of information as to what they, Native Americans as well as Black folks that work in the maritime industry, I sure would like to get some more information. I know that after the strike in 1934, when we organized, I know that the Black population was key to our organization of the ships on the West Coast.
That's a really good reference. That's the big strike, 1934, the longshoreman strike, yeah. And there were quite a number of Black longshoremen, stevedores, working in Portland, particularly after World War II. They faced some discrimination from the ILUW, who I think only let them be auxiliary members for a time. But there's a long history there. And it is definitely something that's worthy of a book-length investigation. I think Oregon Historical Quarterly has some articles that they've published over the years related to Black people working in the contemporary maritime industry. Historical stuff, thinking back to the days of tall ships, steamships. I would recommend that book, Sailing to Freedom, which I had a picture of on screen here, to talk about the Maritime Underground Railroad. It's a pretty exciting story. And as well, I know that there are individual books about Black ship captains from the age of sail. There was at least one point a Connecticut whale ship with an entirely black crew. I can't remember what it was called. It had some great name like the Dolphin or something like that. But I would love to learn more about that myself. I used to work for the tall ships, Lady Washington and Hawaiian Chieftain, and so for me, it was always really wonderful to get to be out on the ocean on these great ships. And I knew then that there was a history of people of African descent who have shared those experiences too, but it's not readily available to be able to do many presentations. More research to be done. Thank you.
So Zachary, you really bring to light the fact that there were quite a few African Americans in what we call the Oregon country.
Yes.
Any idea as to what the ratio was of black people coming as slaves, as property of people from Missouri and Kentucky, et cetera, and people coming as freed blacks?
Yeah, it's actually a really difficult question to answer. Not because we don't know the names of the people who came here, but because where do you draw the line, right? So when you're talking about pre-Civil War, the black individuals who came to Oregon, almost all of them had been enslaved at some point in their lives. Very few of them were born into freedom, right? But most of them actually were already emancipated before they came to Oregon. Most of the black individuals who came on the Oregon Trail came as free laborers in service to white families. Now, that doesn't imply that they had perfect opportunities when they got here. I think, as I pointed out, the black exclusion laws took great pains to make sure that they didn't. But most of the black individuals were already free before they came to Oregon. But there were slaves in Oregon. And one of the things that I still can't figure out any explanation for is the fact that the Oregon Constitution, ratified federally in 1859, made it clear in the preamble that slavery is not permitted in Oregon. Oregon was a free state when it entered the Union. But in the 1860 census, there were still 3 enslaved people in Oregon. How does that work, right? So we know of at least 50 people who were held as slaves in Oregon, at least for some point in time. But if you expand that definition to how many black Oregonians have been enslaved at some point in their lives, it's in the hundreds.
Zachary, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
One thing that I really appreciated about this presentation was how many primary sources you had as you were investigating. Can you talk a little bit more about what that process was like and how do you actually track down all of those different primary sources?
For sure. So this is actually our 30th year at Oregon Black Pioneers. We're 30 years old this year. And prior to me getting hired in 2020, it was all volunteer run. So each of you has the capacity and the talent to do research like this on your own if you have the time and are willing to look into the sources yourselves, because that's what happened for our organization. We had a group of community volunteers who would just get together sometimes on weekends and dig up any information that they could about Oregon's black history. They didn't always know exactly what they were looking at. Like those random bits that I started with, they found a catalog card for Abner Francis and they decided to save it. They found a newspaper clipping which mentioned a shipwreck in around Oregon with black Oregonians who had died in it. But they didn't otherwise know how to contextualize those things. They just saved it. It was only after, frankly, I have this sort of background. I have the professional training to be able to start to put the pieces together. But it all starts with the collective, right? So the sources were instrumental in the research. I couldn't have done this just relying on what was already printed, because my main source on the Brother Jonathan dismissed the black history connections entirely. And the people who are local to where the ship went down also dismissed this, right? It was only by looking at what was actually written in the newspapers themselves and seeing what we could find in the census records, right? Or in the PhD level dissertations done by people who had looked into this back in the 1950s. That sort of in-depth research is critical to really uncovering what are the ties that connect all of these different stories. So for me, it's a tedious process, but it's one that I find very exciting. I was telling this person here that for me, this is my shipwreck, right? I'm getting to do the treasure hunting when I find a new source that can answer a question that I didn't even know I had. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in this sort of thing, and you think that there's more to the story than what you see in the 50-word blurb, dig into it. Newspapers.com, Ancestry.com, Federal Census Bureaus. There's clues there.
Does anyone have any other questions for Zachary?
Did I understand correctly that there were several who moved back to Oregon from Vancouver? Like, do you have a theory as to why they did?
Yes, yes, thank you for reminding me of that. So many of the members, most of the members of the Black expat community did come back to the United States. They came back after the Civil War and the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments. So what had been so enticing about Victoria in the first place was the fact that once they arrived, they would be able to have immediate citizenship. They could vote, they could own property, they could participate in the gold rush. Now they have federal protections to ensure those things could happen in the United States. And because most of them probably still had family in the US, they just made a decision to come home. A few of them stayed, and they became the earliest Black families in BC. But most of them did return to the United States and spread from there.
All right, well, let's give Zachary one last round of applause.